I want to say thank you so much to everybody here for having me, and also to Farah and the Keiths, which sounds like an amazing band name, for their engaging perspectives. And I guess what I'm hoping to do today is draw on everything they've said to give you some perspective that stems from the work I've been doing over the last few years covering immigration policy from Ottawa, from the federal national perspective. Because everybody raises a good point here about what matters is how we talk about the issue, and I think that politicians in this country and politics play a massive role in how we talk about this issue. And I'm going to sort of frame my discussion with you guys today in three different ways: how I see politicians both creating anxiety around around immigration, how I see them manipulating or perpetuating it, and how potentially they might be able to play a role in alleviating it. So we'll start with the creating. As the Keiths sort of alluded to, that politicians in this country would even seek to create public anxiety around immigration seems to make no sense. If you look at the changing demographics of our population, the fact that there are dozens of ridings where first or second generation Canadians make up, if not the majority, then enough of a population to swing the vote, what good is there to be had for any politician to seek to create some anxiety? And this is something that, as Keith alluded to, the former Conservative government knew very, very well. And not only did they know it, they set out a deliberate strategy to attract the support among the ethnic communities. And I know that many of you might know this firsthand, but maybe you don't, how targeted that strategy was. I mean, we're talking about a party under Jason Kenney that drew up a list of ridings and systematically devised policy, promises, advertising, and outreach specific to those communities. That was 2011. The Conservatives won a majority government. And you know Jason Kenney, his nickname, right? Minister for Curry in a hurry. But it worked, right? There's research after that 2011 federal election that showed that the Conservatives attracted, I don't have slides like these cool guys here, the Tories attracted 42% of the vote from foreign-born Canadians, which is actually higher than the 37% share they had among people who were born here. So it's pretty significant that those efforts worked, and in 2015 they would go on to take them even further. In that election, Jason Kenney was basically running a shadow campaign. You had Stephen Harper was out, doing the front work. You'd see him on the media every night. Below that, you had Jason Kenney doing between 10 and 12 events a day, going to specific ethnic communities, and he was making promises to those communities that appeared nowhere in the Conservatives' federal election platform. Like, he was promising to open consulates. He was promising to open visa centers. He was doing things that the rest of Canada, who weren't engaged in that particular ethnic group, would have no idea that was happening. And what's interesting about it is when I asked Jason Kenney at the time, why? Why are you doing it? And, there was the answer about the rising share of visible minority voters and all that stuff, but his other answer was his opponent. It was who the Tories were running against in 2015, and that was Justin Trudeau. Why was this a problem for the Conservatives? The Tories had a fear that what was going to happen in 2015 was that a lot of first-generation newcomers to this country, people who had been here a long time, were going to vote Liberal. And why? Because it was Pierre Trudeau who brought them here in the first place. And all the work that the Conservatives had done, they were risking because of this historical attachment to brand Trudeau. And Kenney's whole job was to dismantle brand Trudeau. It's the Conservative point of view. Other people will say that by the time we got to the 2015 election, that a lot of visible minority voters were tired of the Conservatives' policies around immigration in particular. And they were tired of the tone. And I'm not really necessarily talking about the niqab, and I'm not talking about this out-of-nowhere crackdown on barbaric cultural practices. Though that was an exceptionally divisive approach we saw during the election. But what I actually mean is the way that the Tories started talking about immigration and the way they framed the debate, starting in 2011, moving and through their 4 years in majority government. And this was to talk about it not just in economic and security terms, which they did, because as the Keiths point out, when you frame immigration as an economic positive, that's how you get social license. So that's great. Let's talk about economic immigration. And the Conservatives continued on a path that was set by many governments prior to them of increasing the economic class of immigrants. Okay. But what else did they do? They did that increase at the expense of family class and at the expense of refugees. Again, previous governments had done that. But how did the Conservatives talk about those other classes of immigrants, right? How did they frame the issue? And what they started talking about was about that they were freeloaders, that they were coming here and taking advantage of Canada's generous social programs, and this idea of the so-called bogus refugee, failed refugee claimant. And again, not a new term. This was around in the 1990s as well. I'll return to that a little bit later because our current immigration minister has some direct experience with that. But the point is that the Conservatives made a big deal out of these failed refugee claimants, bogus refugee claimants, and they used this as a justification to dismantle, as you all know very well, the interim federal health program and to destroy it. And they did it because they said people were coming here to take advantage of our generous social safety net, that they didn't deserve it, and that one of the enduring myths that they get better health care than the average Canadian. And that's a myth that I'm sure you all know well, endures to this day. You will see it on Facebook, you will see, I don't know where it came from, who did the little graphic, but it circulates and circulates and circulates. And that, to me, is a legacy of how the Conservatives chose to talk about immigration, and I think it's a great example of politicians creating public anxiety. Because I would argue that if you ask the average Canadian back in 2012, hey, have you ever heard of the interim federal health program? The answer would be no. What? What is the interim federal? I don't know. What do I care? And all of a sudden, they manifested this public support for a program that most people didn't know existed. And so you have to ask, if we know what we know about the support they had among those communities, why would they do that? And this is what I'm hoping you sort of all take from my speech, is applying a political lens to why these guys do what they do, all politicians. And the reason, in my assessment, in my observation, was that at the time, the Conservatives were actually looking to save a lot of money, hundreds and millions of dollars in government spending. And they identified the interim federal health program as one place where maybe they could chop a few $100 million. And they could do it by making a political argument, because the Conservatives, and no politician ever does something unless they can make a political case for it. And what was happening in the debate around immigration at that time, this reframing in the economic context, was that we wanted to be prioritizing economic immigrants, that they were at the front of the line, that they were coming through the way Canada wanted them. And so we should be putting our focus on that. And the Tories had a lot of social license among certain classes of, certain groups of immigrants who actually agreed with that, who saw people coming in through the refugee stream, through the family sponsorship stream, as somehow jumping the queue. And I think, the Keiths and I were talking before this about how the Conservatives actually maintained support among these communities, and in some cases increased it well throughout the 2015 election. And that's interesting because, the fact that refugees and immigration policy would go on to become such an issue in the 2015 election, I think caught a lot of people off guard. And we were at a point with the 2015 vote where, the Syrian refugee crisis was reaching a peak right ahead of that campaign. But as I think it was Keith pointed out to me before, the Conservatives were maintaining solid public support for how they were handling that refugee crisis. They were. There might be people in this room who would say we should have been doing more at the time, but the average Canadian was sort of on side with the managed, very limited response to date. But what happened in the 2015 election was the Liberal promise for 25,000 Syrian refugees. And this is where I'm going to get into the idea of manipulating or perpetuating public anxiety about immigration. You might think it's an odd segue, right? I mean, why would the Liberals promising to accept 25,000 refugees be a case of manipulating public anxiety? I'm very cynical about politics. So, anxiety about immigration is something we usually frame in negative terms, that immigration is a bad thing, people are worried about immigrants, newcomers will steal our jobs, we've all talked about that. But I think it could be looked at another way, and I think that what the Liberals managed to do with their promise on Syrian refugees was seize on an anxiety that Canada wasn't doing enough, that Canada wasn't doing its part. Where, of course, that anxiety came from is the tragic story of Alan Kurdi, which I don't necessarily need to go over with all of you, but this photograph of a Syrian child who died, and his body is there lifeless, was gripping enough. And then, of course, the story emerges that his family was trying to come to Canada. And I mean, and I went back for this speech to reflect on the political responses of the day, and, all three federal party leaders sort of tried to, express some emotion, but I very clearly remember I was traveling with the Conservative campaign the day that it emerged. That was a store, it might have been Canada who turned them away. And I remember watching Stephen Harper's response, and I remember thinking, that's it, Stephen Harper just lost the election. Because that picture was so compelling, and the narrative was just so compelling. And it seemed to me in that moment that what Canadians were looking for was not a political response, but a human response. And I think to some measure he just failed to deliver that. And I think that that was a real turning point for the election. And you can even see what's interesting is how each political party responded. The NDP at that point in the 2015 campaign, if you can believe it, were leading in the polls. They were actually like ahead of both other political parties. And Tom Mulcair, in his response to the Kurdi photo, was very telling, because he talked about, he put forward a New Democrat plan. They were going to get 10,000 Syrian refugees in by the end of the year. They were going to lift the cap on private sponsorship. And then he talked about needing Canada. It wasn't just Canada, the world needs to step up. Anxiety about immigration. Tom Mulcair's problem in the 2015 election was that no one was taking Tom Mulcair seriously as a potential leader of the country. The NDP weren't into him, and the rest of the country wasn't into him either. And he was trying to frame himself as this statesman, this person. But for the strong core of NDP supporters, they looked at that response and said, that's it, 10,000, what's that? And along come the Liberals with their promise for 25,000 people. So, to me, that was a fit with the Liberal brand. The biggest offer that they were hoping to make to the Canadian people in 2015 was a promise of a change of tone in government, that Canada, this mythical Canada we all seem to know, is going to be back. And what better way to communicate that change than to throw open Canada's doors? And I'm not saying you're going to say, God, she's so cynical. But I'm not saying that the Liberals didn't want to do more to help Syrian refugees. I don't. It's just a question of when you unpack the policy, you have to ask a lot of questions about why they put it forward, and I'll tell you why I think that. When John McCallum became the immigration minister and I sat down with him and I said, I'm just curious, why 25,000? Like, where did that number come from? What is you're an evidence-based government, what's your evidence that that's the number? And his answer was, I'm quoting directly, I don't think there's anything scientific in it. He said, I think relative to our contributions in the past, relative to what we thought would be a good, solid contribution, we thought that was the right number. So they just picked a political number. It was just a number. It didn't mean anything. And then the whole idea that they were going to get them here by the end of December 2015, I spent, I'm not joking, 3 full days trying to figure out where that came from. Like a direct quote, whose idea was it? The NDP had suggested it, but that it somehow became Justin Trudeau's thing, I have no idea where that came from. And so the Syrian refugee promise, it was a political promise. And although the Liberals made the case time and time again, it didn't matter to most Canadians, the deadline or whatever, that the process was underway, that was a political commitment they had to meet, and nobody ever challenged them on it. And, I bear responsibility for that too, right? The media, we all focus on the deadline, are they going to get them here in time? But no one ever stopped to really challenge the government on the question about, is this the right thing, never mind for you, but for the Syrians? Are we doing right by these people? By rushing them here by the end of the year, and I know from doing stories, talking to a lot of you, the answer to that might have been no. The answer was the system was overburdened, that the system didn't have the resources in it, that it was all on the fly, and maybe we'll see over time, and I know later we're going to talk about outcomes of Syrian integration. It'll be really interesting to see over time what the outcomes are like, and how was that affected by this crazy time crunch that was placed on all of it for no other reason than politics. So that's, I've talked about how politicians create anxiety, how they might manipulate that anxiety. What about alleviating that anxiety? Is there something they can do besides, creating it in the first place? So, as both Keiths have pointed out, public polls suggest that support for immigration remains largely constant in Canada. A poll that they didn't use, and again, I don't have the slide, but is that every year before the government puts out its immigration levels plan, they do their own polling on immigration sentiment. And this year, the poll revealed a slight dip in support across the board for immigration. And I say slight, I'm not talking like statistically significant bottoming out. But the point is there was a dip. And there was a dip on all the markers that they used. So for example, fewer Canadians believed that immigration was not just a good thing for Canada, but for their own neighborhood, for their own city. Sort of all these sorts of markers that suggested a slight softening in support. And so you could say, well, we're not immune to the Donald Trump effect here in Canada. Everybody watches CNN, they watch Fox, and some of that's going to rub off on our public perception of immigration. I think there's a case to be made for that. When I asked the immigration minister, Ahmed Hussein, what he thought was responsible for it, he had a really interesting answer. And he said, the influx of asylum seekers at the border. And what's interesting about that is he's right. The pollsters were actually out at the exact period of time over the summer where we were hearing about hundreds of people a day coming across the border. And Hussein's, I see I'm out of time. Look at that. And I'll wrap up fast. And Hussein's perspective was just that when people perceive that the border is not being managed effectively, it taints their perception of the entire system. So then one has to ask, what responsibility does the government itself bear in making sure that doesn't happen? And in the case of the asylum seekers, I would suggest that the Liberals were really behind the ball on this one. They took a long time to get up to speed with public anxiety on this, and I think this can actually be explained best in two competing answers that were given last winter when people were crossing in Manitoba, and there was that story you might all remember of a bunch of folks that were found in a snowstorm near a barn. I said that I found Ahmed Hussein really interesting. I don't have time to talk to you about why, but when he was asked, Minister, I mean, aren't you worried? Like, people could die out there. And he was like, we have it under control. It's fine. It's no big deal. And I think the point was, though, the perception is that it was a problem. People could die. And the government response was, it's fine. It's under control. And maybe at the time, 10 people crossing a day is not 100,000 crossing a day in Germany. I understand the relativeness of that, okay? But the imagery, the perception is problematic. Then you had Ralph Goodale, longtime minister. He's held a zillion portfolios. Ralph Goodale was asked the exact same question. And, Minister, what do you think? What's happening? And what he said was, well, the government needs to find out who exactly is dropping these people off at the border in snowstorms. Why is this being allowed to happen in the United States? And it was a perfect political response. Why? He demonstrated he understood people's concern. He offered some compassion for everybody involved, and then he just blamed somebody else. So the point, I guess, and I'll just wrap up quickly. I think the point is that when we might talk about how politicians could alleviate public anxiety about immigration, is that the first thing they have to do is acknowledge it exists. And, for all the factors that Keith addresses about the risks for populism, there's a lot of drivers there that make people anxious about immigration. And to just sort of, I wonder sometimes if the current government isn't, hashtag welcome to Canada. People love that, but there's a subset of people who don't. And dismissing them out of hand as being xenophobic, intolerant, racist, I'm not sure goes, this is the room of the converted, so to speak. And I think everyone needs to be spending a lot more time speaking to everybody else. And I'll close here so there's time for questions. Thank you.